This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Jacques Herbin Emerald of Chivor. I'll be testing it in a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Faber-Castell Ambition Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at a writing sample that I did earlier on 20-pound copy paper. I'll look at some comparable inks from my collection. And I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. This is disclaimer time. Jacques Herbin Emerald of Chivor looks very turquoise in my viewfinder. It looks mostly blue, but in real life it's got more of a teal color to it. It's got a little bit of green in it. Now when I was writing with my glass dip pen, the ink came off the nib very quickly. And it wrote very smooth. It was very pleasant to write with, but very wet. The ink swatch that I did with my tweezers was very wet. It was pretty fun to watch it. You could see the shimmer swirling around in the ink because the ink just flowed out of these tweezers as I drug it across the page. Judging from this swatch, I don't know if there's going to be much shading because it is so wet coming out off of the nib and out of the tweezers, but the little drip at the end, you can see there's a nice halo of pink sheen and lots of I don't think that's just gold shimmer. Maybe it might be gold and a little bit of silver, but in the ink swatch, in real life it almost looks multicolored. I'm going to begin my writing samples with a Faber-Castell Ambition. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib, and you can see that the ink really wanted to stick to the nib. It really coated the nib when I dipped it in the ink. This is a very saturated ink, and I love writing with it, especially in these fine nibs. Ever since I first got into fountain pens, I've liked fine nibs, and I really appreciate a nice saturated ink. And this was, I have to say, this was smooth on this Tomoe River paper. Next, I'll be writing with my TWSBI Mini. It has a stainless steel fine nib. And this is interesting. It looks like the Faber-Castell Ambition Extra Fine was putting down more ink than my TWSBI Mini. And I kind of noticed that on the scribble. With this wider nib and less ink, it's putting it down in a thinner layer. So my scribble for the TWSBI Mini looks brighter than the scribble for the Ambition Extra Fine. This was also very smooth. This was glassy smooth. Next, I'll be writing with my Kaweco Perkeo. It has a stainless steel medium nib, and you can see it's got a coating of shimmer where I've dipped it in the ink. That's interesting. Now, I have had issues before with some inks drying in the nib of this pen, and I wonder if these really saturated inks that want to cling to the nib will tend to dry and kind of block up the flow of the rest of the ink, because that looks really good, but my pen hasn't been sitting around long. It's been sitting on my desk a couple hours. These nibs have all been dipped. So I have a feeling if I waited much longer, this might dry up enough that it wouldn't write. Now, if that means it wouldn't write with ink in the converter, I'm not sure. I have used an ink in here before. It was like a orangish brown, and it would crust up on the nib and completely stop the flow of ink. But this was velvety smooth, not glassy smooth like the TWSBI. Next, I'll be writing with my Pilot Pluminix. It has a stainless steel cursive medium nib. All right, this is leaning a little toward the dry side. Medium wetness maybe would be more accurate, but you can kind of see in the letters, sometimes this Pluminix spreads the ink out in such a thin layer that it looks pale and unattractive, but this ink is so saturated that when you spread it out in a thin layer, it actually brightens it up. That's a nice feature of this ink, and this was smooth. Next, I've got my Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. I would call that buttery smooth. That was in between velvety and glassy smooth. Just very pleasant to write with. I'm curious to see what reverse writing looks like. This broad nib is just a really nice reverse writer. Nice. Now I have a Kaweco double broad, and just the regular writing looks very similar to this broad nib. I kind of use them interchangeably. The only difference is this broad nib just reverse writes like it was meant to write like that. Fantastic. I like using this whenever I'm going to be needing to write broad lines and fine lines. But the double broad nib is a little bit scratchy. I've worked on it. I've used some micro mesh to smooth it out a little bit, but I think I'm going to have to work on it a little bit more. The reverse writing is much drier, so I think I got lucky on this one. I don't know how common it is for these nibs to be nice reverse writers, but I will say I think my stainless steel medium that came on my AL Sport, it's a nice reverse writer also. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750, and I've got it outfitted with a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. Again, this just felt buttery smooth, very luxurious feeling to the writing experience. Okay, while that dries, I'll take a look at the writing sample that I did on 20-pound copy paper. There seems to be so much shimmer in this ink, but the copy paper apparently just absorbs the shimmer. Those shimmer particles are so fine compared to the shimmer particles that you find in a lot of fountain pen inks, and it seems that they just get absorbed into the paper. Now occasionally, if the paper turns and the light just hits it just right, you'll see a little sparkle, but I think the average person would not notice that this is a shimmer ink. The ink performed really well on the paper. I'm not really seeing any feathering. The letters don't look very ragged. It didn't really feel like the ink was spreading when I was writing on the paper. Everything felt nice. You can see on the back of this paper, when you compare the other writing samples, Emerald of Chivor did bleed through the paper pretty significantly, but it's a darker ink, it's very saturated, so even when it's just show through, you're really seeing it. And the ink dried really quickly, or it got sucked into the paper, because I make my X and wipe it immediately, and there was absolutely no smearing of the ink. This Jacques Herbin Emerald of Chivor is an ink that's been out for several years now, and when it first came out, I loved it. It's beautiful. I love watching other people do swatches and writing samples with it, but it just seemed a little over the top for me. But the last time I picked up some ink samples, I got a sample of it for comparison's sake. I had used a Jacques Herbin shimmer ink, and I really liked it, the Vert Atlantide. And when I started playing with this ink, it's just a fun ink to play with. It's like being mesmerized by a lava lamp. It's just fun to watch the ink going down on the paper. So I went through my ink samples to see if I had anything similar, and it's hard to find something similar to Emerald of Chivor. If you look at this little drier part of the swatch and you compare it to Sailor Manyo Yomagi, that looks similar. And Yomagi has just a slight hint of pink sheen in the heaviest parts, whereas Emerald of Chivor has quite a bit of sheen. Lamy Amazonite is similar. If you compare it to this drier part of the swatch, they're similar, and it's got the similar color sheen, but just not quite as much. Yamadori is a little more blue, less teal and a little more blue. It may be hard to see because everything's looking blue in my viewfinder, but Yamadori had a little bit more darker shading, kind of like Emerald of Chivor did, but no shimmer. And Organic Studio Santiago Sea Blue had just a bit more sheen than Emerald of Chivor did, but no shimmer. I've had trouble with Santiago Sea Blue drying up in the nib of my pen. I haven't written with it since I played with it for my writing samples, but I think I'm going to dilute it with some water and play with it a little more because that is a beautiful ink. But I don't really have anything that compares exactly to Emerald of Chivor. It's a pretty unique ink. I was a little bit surprised by the amount of ink that was left behind. I wouldn't call this water resistant, but you can read a lot of the writing after this water resistance test. I submerge the paper in water for 10 minutes, and it's readable in everything except for the finest of the nibs, and it's kind of neat on these shimmer inks. You can see, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but the shimmer, a lot of it is left behind. Okay, let's take a look at the writing sample that I did on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. I'm worried about what the back of this is going to look like. All right, all of the writing is fine. The only bleed through I had is on the glass dip pen, the first bit of writing where it wrote really wet, and on the swatch. There's quite a bit of show through, but I'm pretty impressed. It did better than I thought it would. This is just mesmerizing. And I'm noticing the Kaweco Perkeo, even though it was a fairly dry writer, it was the driest of all the pens that I used, there is a significant amount of sheen. I guess since it's drier, less of the shimmers obscuring the sheen. In the Pluminix, it was also somewhat of a drier writer, and that just made it the brightest of all the writing samples. The Stub nib does have the most shimmer. I'm kind of surprised. I'm not seeing a lot of shimmer in my Kaweco Sport. The writing samples that have the most shimmer are the Ambition. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. I waited till a bad time of the day. My lighting's not great. The Ambition has a lot of shimmer, and the Stub nib does. This is just a fun ink to play with. This is a great ink for letter writing and signing cards. I'm waiting for my next trip to Van Ness Pens. Originally, I was going to pick up a bottle of Jacques Herbin Vert Atlantide, but now I'm leaning toward getting a bottle of Emerald of Chivor and possibly picking up, instead of the Vert Atlantide, getting a bottle of the Atramentis Jane Austen. Those two inks have a similar vibe. Oh well, this has been fun today. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.